Hello everyone. This is the first substantive talk entitled, What is Knowledge? Let me preface this by saying that I don't really have knowledge. It's something we all seek. Often those who claim to have it are the ones we should be most suspicious about. Today, what I'm going to do instead is to talk to you about the kinds of knowledge that people seek. I do this because in social science and in international relations in particular, people frame the problem very differently. They seek different kinds of knowledge by different means. Before I analyze this, however, I want to put the question of knowledge in a broader perspective, which I will then use to frame my presentation of how different international relations theorists seek knowledge. To do this, I go back to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. They were among the first people to think seriously about this kind of issue and came up with 4 generic categories of knowledge. The first of these is called techne in ancient Greek. It resonates with modern English word technology, technological, technical. It has to do with artisanship, with the ability to produce or fix something. It's a technical and artistic kind of knowledge. Everybody ranging from carpenters to potters might be said to have techne. Plato discovered that when he went around and asked people what knowledge was, those who had techne said that they had knowledge and they equated it with their craft. Plato thought that this was all right, but indeed only one kind of knowledge. Aristotle theorized a second kind of knowledge that referred to scientific knowledge and used the term episteme for it. Our word epistemological, which we'll use frequently in these talks, derives from it. For Aristotle, episteme was, as I said, scientific knowledge, and in particular that which could even find expression in mathematics. So a very modern understanding in some ways of how we frame the enterprise of science. I imagine if Plato or his equivalent were to go around today and ask people, particularly scientists or even some social scientists, what is knowledge? Their answer would be episteme. And indeed, society places great emphasis on this kind of knowledge. Although sitting here in the United States at the height of the COVID pandemic, I'm certainly witnessing a president and administration who are doing their very best to dismiss the importance and relevance and authority of science. Plato would also find that people who held out episteme as their gold were perhaps in their own way as arrogant as the craftsmen he had interrogated about techne. Aristotle theorized a third kind of knowledge called phronesis, which is often translated as prudence or practical knowledge. And phronesis is in effect the kind of knowledge that lets us get on in the world and to formulate intelligent and reasonable goals and find the appropriate means of achieving them. It requires reflection, learning from social encounters, the ability to develop interpersonal skills, as well as political nous or intelligence to know how to use them in ways that will get you where you want to go. And finally, Greeks had a fourth understanding of knowledge, a greater sense of wisdom than techne, episteme, or phronesis, which they called sophia, and that has become translated as wisdom in English. You can think of the famous church in Constantinople now, a mosque that was Hagia Sophia. For the ancient Greeks, sophia referred to a holistic understanding that people had or might develop. It took a lot of effort to develop, of their place in the city, the world, if not the universe, that integrated them in such a way that it would both minimize the kinds of threats they faced, but also come with recognition that they could not be avoided, and would lead to the kinds of choices that had the greatest potential of making them happy. I suppose today we might associate sophia with certain kinds of figures who have behaved ethically and effectively on behalf of other people, even more than for themselves. We might associate it with the kind of wisdom that might develop from familiarity with great literature of different cultures of the world or philosophy. It's a difficult thing to come by, and for the Greeks it wasn't something that was easily achieved, but rather something of a goal toward which one aspired. With these categories in mind, we can now come to social science and international relations. I'm going to suggest that the deepest division in international relations is between researchers who generally fit within the positivist tradition, and I'll explain this in detail later, and those whose research might be described as interpretivist. Very briefly, again I say we'll come back to this, positivists believe in social science sharing fundamental similarities with the physical sciences and seeking universal knowledge that can be expressed in simple, formal ways, a hierarchy of knowledge, and the ability to use that knowledge both to explain and predict. Positivists, is very clear, seek what the ancient Greeks call episteme. Interpretivism is, again, a kind of catch-all term that generally refers to people who reject all of the assumptions of positivism and believe that all knowledge is cultural and local because it is embedded in cultures, in languages, and practices. That at best we can have general understandings of how things work, that politics is more of an art than a science, that the knowledge that's helpful for us in understanding and or practicing politics is phronesis, prudence and practical wisdom. Now, I don't have time in today's talk to cover both positivism and interpretivism, so instead I'm going to use the time that remains to talk about positivism. Positivism is very clearly a modern European or modern phenomenon of European origin. The first real positivist philosopher is Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, an early 19th century Frenchman who thought that positive knowledge of the world was possible. The positivist enterprise received perhaps its fullest elaboration in what is called neopositivism, a school of thought associated with a circle of physicists and philosophers who came together in pre- and post-war World War I Vienna. So in the second decade and third decade of the 20th century, who believed that science and math at the time rested on arbitrary foundations, that it was necessary to provide logical warrants for them so that people had justifications for making truth claims, that those claims could be tested. Positivism and neopositivism assume that the world is out there, independent of us. They certainly recognize that the world is described by the concepts and procedures that we develop. But those concepts and procedures only give us insight into something that is already there. Neopositivists in particular believed that by either proving or later falsifying propositions and theories, we would over time develop more insightful concepts and theories, and through this trial and error process come ever closer to developing concepts and theories that actually captured the reality of the world. That the knowledge that this produced would in the end be hierarchical. The goal was a theory of everything, as it was until really quite recently for many physicists. That other theories and understandings could be subsumed to it. And moreover, that this kind of understanding, there was no logical distinction between explanation and prediction. Explanation merely applied to events that had happened in the past, and prediction to those that would happen in the future. There is, again here, the central belief on the part of people that social science should proceed the same way as the physical sciences. This is called unity of science. Where the Vienna School made its most interesting contribution had to do with how we go about thinking of truths. And initially, it looked for ways of verifying them. But Karl Popper, who was not a formal member of the school, but an associate, and became quite a famous philosopher of science, developed the notion instead of falsification. He argues that suppose you say all swans are white, and every swan you find swimming on ponds and lakes by you is white. That doesn't prove that all swans are white. In fact, all it does is create a provisional acceptance of your claim. There could always be a swan somewhere else that was black. Popper reasoned, therefore, the shortcut is not to wait for one of these to be blown off course and land in your pond and refute your thesis, but rather one should make every effort from the outset not to prove propositions, but to falsify them, to look for ways of showing that they're wrong. And to do this, you have to set up your propositions and theories in a way that they can be decisively tested. Your terms have to be clear, understandable to everyone. You have to specify the scope of your theory or proposition, the domain in which it applies and where it doesn't, the conditions associated with what you're predicting. In the absence of this, you can always use string and bubblegum to try to put together some explanation that incorporates what appears to be contrary finding. So for Popper, he was akin to the Vienna Circle and positivism more generally in believing in social science as a hard science, but developing the methods that would allow it to behave as one. Now, in subsequent talks, I'll show you that not all positivists buy in to this Popperian understanding of science. As in the interpretivist tradition, there's a lot of variation about how people think and what they believe that knowledge ultimately is. But positivists nevertheless share this common view of social science as a scientific enterprise, resulting in scientific knowledge used for explanation and prediction, and theories and propositions that can readily be falsified or not by empirical tests. In my next talk, we will discuss interpretivism, and we will then, in subsequent talks, compare interpretivism with positivism, but also look at the different techniques that both use for seeking knowledge. Thank you very much.